On the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda, the principal architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, watching his second wave of aircraft disappear toward Oahu. Genda had spent 11 months meticulously refining every detail of the attack, calculating American fleet strength down to individual destroyers, and memorizing the layout of Pearl Harbor from reconnaissance photos. But there was one critical number Genda and the entire Japanese naval intelligence apparatus had fundamentally wrong. That number, the estimated strength of the United States Navy by December 1943, was projected by the Japanese High Command to be 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The actual strength on that date was 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 2,034,343 enlisted personnel. They had miscalculated by a factor of more than 7 to 1. This was not a minor error. It was a fundamental failure to understand the enemy they were fighting, and by the time they discovered the truth, it was too late. The flow of raw data was not the problem. Intelligence officer Ensaku Tao Yoshikawa, operating under diplomatic cover in Honolulu 9 months before the attack, sent back detailed and accurate reports on fleet movements and base infrastructure. The problem lay in Tokyo's analysis. Headquarters counted the ships Yoshikawa observed and then calculated the crews required using Japanese manning standards, lean, maximum efficiency crews. They assumed the Americans did the same, an assumption that was profoundly incorrect. Japanese intelligence officers had access to extensive information, including attaché reports, technical publications, and captured documents. But having information is not the same as understanding it. The intelligence apparatus suffered from organizational weaknesses. Intelligence was viewed as a secondary, less prestigious function, and reports that contradicted operational assumptions were often ignored. The entire strategic basis of Japan's war plan, seizing the resource areas of Southeast Asia, establishing a defensive perimeter, and forcing a negotiated peace, depended on the assumption that American naval forces would be severely limited by manpower. Japanese planners, including Captain Toshikazu Omai, calculated that the U.S. Navy could sustain only about 40 major combatants in the Pacific. They believed they would be fighting a contained war against a numerically limited opponent. This error stemmed from a phenomenon called mirror imaging. Japanese officers looked at American practices through a Japanese lens, expecting to see what they themselves valued: elite crews, careful selection, and slow, methodical expansion, like their own Navy, which expanded only threefold over 4 years. They projected their own limitations onto an enemy with a completely different capacity for mass mobilization. The reality of American naval expansion was a scale Japanese intelligence could not imagine. In June 1941, the U.S. Navy had about 284,000 active duty personnel. Just 18 months later, in December 1942, that number had surged to 1,640,000, and by December 1943, it exceeded 2.3 million. The growth was exponential, fueled by a population of 131 million and far fewer social constraints on military service than Japan faced. The Japanese knew America could build ships faster, but they failed to grasp that America could simultaneously recruit, train, and deploy the personnel to man those vessels at an unmatched pace. They were not prepared to see an enemy capable of expanding its navy tenfold in under 4 years. The first warning signs of this colossal error began appearing in the field. During the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, American forces centered on 2 carriers were estimated to have 7,000 to 9,000 personnel in the operational area, nearly double the manning levels Japanese planners had assumed for a 2-carrier force. The warning was dismissed as inefficiency. The second, more brutal warning came a month later at Midway. Following the battle, Japanese intelligence was shocked not just by the loss of 4 carriers, but by the American damage control on the carrier Yorktown. The ship, which should have sunk based on Japanese doctrine, was brought from dead in the water to 20 knots and resumed air operations within 2 hours of being hit. A recovered crew list from the Yorktown showed over 2,200 names, confirming manning levels nearly 50% higher than Japanese estimates. This meant 50% more damage control, maintenance, and sustained operational capacity, but Tokyo still failed to adjust its fundamental estimates. The third warning arrived in August 1942 with the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese intelligence had expected a limited American force of 8,000 to 10,000 men. Instead, U.S. Marine forces landed with 11,000 on Guadalcanal alone, supported by a naval force that required over 30,000 sailors. Submarine patrols reported supply ship traffic at levels that seemed impossible for a navy Tokyo believed had fewer than 400,000 total personnel. The Americans were running a major offensive in the Solomons while simultaneously conducting Atlantic convoy operations, training new units, and supporting shipbuilding. The math simply did not work, but Tokyo chose to believe the Americans were overextended and would soon break. By early 1943, even Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who understood America's industrial and organizational power from direct observation in the 1920s, sent a blunt cable questioning the intelligence estimates. This finally triggered a comprehensive reassessment. Intelligence officers systematically analyzed every sighting, intercept, and captured document from the past 18 months. Their preliminary totals were over 850,000 personnel, more than double the official estimates. When documented American manning standards were applied, the total rose to 1,200,000 active operational personnel, not including the vast training pipeline. The resulting reports, submitted in the spring of 1943, concluded that Japanese intelligence estimates were low by a factor of at least 3 to 1. The cultural assumption that mobilization had natural, slow limits colored the analysis, and the idea of training hundreds of thousands of sailors in months contradicted everything the Japanese naval culture understood about competence.
In July 1943, a captured American radio operator provided dramatic, unvarnished testimony. He described his boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, as processing 20,000 new sailors every month through basic training programs that lasted only 8 weeks. He mentioned 3 other major facilities with similar capacity. If true, the Americans were adding close to 1 million new sailors per year. Though the interrogation report made it to Tokyo, it was again questioned and dismissed as exaggeration, remaining unverified for planning purposes.
Verification finally came from an unexpected source. In September 1943, German naval intelligence shared a report from a U-boat commander in the Atlantic who had observed American destroyer escorts carrying an estimated crew of 180 to 200 personnel. Japanese destroyer escorts of comparable size operated with only 100 to 120 crew. This 50% difference in manning was the confirmation of a pattern Japanese analysts had been reluctant to acknowledge across the entire U.S. fleet. September 1943 was the month Tokyo quietly began to acknowledge their fundamental error. A new working group was formed, and 6 weeks later, their report placed American naval personnel strength at 1.8 million in mid-1943, with projected growth to 2.4 million by mid-1944. Though still conservative, the strategic implications were staggering. The Americans could simultaneously run major offensive operations in the Pacific and full-strength convoy escorts in the Atlantic. They could sustain combat losses at rates Japan could never match and still expand their total force strength. Every assumption, the defensive perimeter, the quick war scenario, and the hope of American war weariness was invalidated. The conclusion was stark. Japan had entered a war against an opponent whose mobilization potential was an order of magnitude greater than predicted. Superior Japanese training and tactics could not overcome a 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage in personnel. Japan could not win a war of attrition. The report went to the highest levels of naval leadership, including Navy Minister Admiral Shigetaro Shimada. The evidence was overwhelming and the analysis was sound, but sharing it widely would have triggered an institutional crisis. Admitting the war was mathematically unwinnable would have caused morale to collapse, and admitting a fundamental intelligence failure to the government or the emperor could have resulted in catastrophic leadership changes. The report was classified at the highest security level, restricted to fewer than 20 officers. Official estimates were quietly updated, but no public announcement or strategic reassessment was ordered. The war continued as if nothing had changed, with field commanders still operating on the outdated assumption that the Americans were approaching their manpower limits. By December 1943, the actual American naval strength of 2,374,094 personnel against the Japanese estimate of 296,000 represented a miscalculation of 7.8 to 1. The failure was analytical, not empirical. Japanese intelligence officers could not conceive of an enemy that mobilized the way America did. They filtered every data point through their own cultural and organizational framework, seeing a mirror image of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This cultural blindness and inability to see beyond their assumptions persisted even as contradictory evidence mounted. In 1944, the consequences played out with brutal inevitability. The United States deployed forces for simultaneous major offensives across multiple theaters, with full-strength naval forces remaining committed to the Atlantic. Japanese commanders faced American task forces that seemed to multiply regardless of losses. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the U.S. deployed a single task force with 15 carriers, 7 battleships, and 70,000 personnel, a force that alone represented a significant portion of the entire Imperial Japanese Navy's personnel strength at the start of the war. The Americans absorbed losses that would have crippled Japan and returned to full operation within hours, demonstrating what unlimited personnel availability meant in practice. They had the reserves, training pipelines, and shore establishments to sustain operations indefinitely, while every Japanese loss was permanent and irreplaceable. The most painful realization for the Japanese officers who finally grasped the truth was that the war had been lost before it started, not due to tactical or strategic errors, but because of fundamental intelligence failure. The entire premise of Japanese strategy, to achieve early victories and force a negotiated settlement, was based on incorrect assumptions about American limitations. While political and economic pressures might have driven Japan to war anyway, accurate intelligence would have fundamentally changed how they fought. Realistic estimates showing a 10-to-1 numerical advantage in personnel might have shifted planning toward limited defensive objectives and earlier negotiations. Instead, the war of total commitment and categorical rejection of compromise was only possible because Japanese leaders wrongly believed they were fighting an enemy with limited resources. Post-war interviews with officers like Commander Chikataka Nakajima confirmed that Japanese naval intelligence was organizationally weak and institutionally marginalized. The system was not designed to challenge fundamental assumptions, but to support decisions already made. Accurate assessment requires the ability to accept uncomfortable truths, something the Japanese system was not built to do. Even Admiral Shimada, who received the dire reports, never publicly acknowledged them, maintaining that Japan fought against overwhelming odds that could not have been foreseen. The final accounting is brutally simple. Japan began the war with 120,000 naval personnel, and through total mobilization grew that force to 300,000 by 1945, a threefold increase. The United States began with 337,000 and grew to over 3.38 million by August 1945, a tenfold increase. They trained and deployed more sailors in the single year of 1944 than Japan had in its entire navy at its peak wartime strength. The intelligence estimate of 296,000 U.S. sailors by December 1943 missed the actual number of 2,034,343 by a factor of nearly 8 to 1. This was a complete failure to understand the fundamental nature of the enemy. The numbers made victory impossible regardless of tactical skill. The intelligence working groups figured out the truth in late 1943, but the institutional incentives pointed towards suppressing the information rather than acting on it. The tragic conclusion is that the truth was discovered, documented, and then buried because acting on it would have required admitting institutional failures that the system could not acknowledge. Japan prepared to fight a war against an enemy that only existed in their imaginations, an enemy that matched their preconceptions. The real enemy operated on a completely different scale with unlimited manpower and organizational capacity. That enemy destroyed Japan not just through superior design, but because there were simply so many more of them. The gap between the 296,000 estimated and the 2,034,343 actual tells the complete story of how one catastrophic intelligence failure determined the outcome of the Pacific War before it truly began.